My mom spent my whole life treating me like trash, but now that she's old and sick, she suddenly thinks I owe her free care. I shut the door in her face. And I want to tell you about the 8 months between the closing of the door and my mother figuring out what kind of mother she had actually been. My mother is named Vivian. Vivian is 74. Vivian had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer a year ago, treated, and was now in remission but requiring ongoing care. The thing about my mother was specific. Vivian had been actively cruel for most of my childhood. Vivian told me at 6 that I had been a mistake. Vivian told me at 9 that my older brother was the favorite and that I should accept it. Vivian attended every event my brother had, and none of mine. Vivian kicked me out at 16 for getting an A- on a calculus test, which Vivian said proved I had been not trying. I am 43. I had been not in contact with Vivian for 25 years. I am a real estate attorney. I am married to Caleb. I have 2 children, ages 13 and 10. My children had never met Vivian. Vivian had never asked. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday evening 8 months ago. Vivian was on my porch with a duffel bag. She looked older than I had been remembering. She said she had nowhere else to go. She said she had cancer. She said she needed me to take care of her. I said, "You have not spoken to me in 25 years. You have not met my children. You cannot show up here and demand care because I share your DNA." She said, "I am your mother. You owe me." I said, "I owe you nothing. You owed me a childhood, and you did not provide one. I am not providing what you did not provide." I closed the door. I stood with my hand on the deadbolt for about a minute. My husband came down the hallway. He had heard the whole exchange from the kitchen. He asked if I was okay. I said I was not okay, but I was right. He said both could be true. I could not sleep that night. I lay in bed next to Caleb and stared at the ceiling, and my brain would not stop playing the image of Vivian standing on my porch with that duffel bag. At 2 in the morning, I got up and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark. Caleb came in about 10 minutes later. He just turned on the small light above the stove and sat across from me. I started talking. I told him about the calculus test. I told him how I had gotten an A- and how Vivian had said that proved I was not trying. I told him how she had put my things in trash bags and left them on the lawn. I told him all of this, and then I said, "I keep thinking about her standing on the porch with that bag. She looked small." Caleb was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Small people can still do big damage." I said I knew that. I said I was not going to call her. Caleb said, "Good, but if you change your mind, I am here for that too." 3 weeks later, my phone rang while I was at my desk. It was Sammy, my older brother. Sammy had not called me in over a year. He said, "Mom is in a facility. She says you turned her away." I said, "I did." Sammy said, "She is 74 and she had cancer." I said, "She kicked me out at 16. Sammy went quiet. Then he said, "That was different." I said, "How was it different?" He could not answer. He just sat there on the other end of the line with nothing to say, because it was not different. Kicking a 16-year-old out of her home over a grade is not different from that same 16-year-old closing her door 25 years later. I said, "You could take care of her." Sammy said, "I am not set up for that." I said, "Neither was I. I was 16. Sammy hung up. That call cracked something open in me. I was distracted all day. When I left the office to pick up Lena from school, I was still somewhere else inside my own head. Lena got in the car and we drove for about 5 minutes before she said, "Mom, you passed the turn." That night after the kids were in bed, I sat with Caleb in the living room and I said, "I need to talk to someone, not Vivian, a therapist." Caleb said, "I think that is the smartest thing you have said all month." My first session was on a Thursday morning before work. I described the doorstep scene. My therapist listened and then she asked me what I felt in the moment I closed the door. I said, "Relief." She nodded and then she said, "What did you feel after the relief?" I said, "Guilt." She said, "Who taught you that guilt?" I sat with that question for a long time. Then I said, "My mother taught me that every boundary I set was a form of cruelty." My therapist said, "And what do you believe now?" I said, "I believe closing the door was the first kind thing I have done for myself in relation to my mother." The first letter arrived in month 2. I came home from work and there it was in the mailbox. Vivian's handwriting on the envelope. "You do not forget your mother's handwriting even when you forget almost everything else about her on purpose." Vivian wrote, "I cannot believe you would leave your own mother in a place like this. After everything I gave you. You owe me better than this." I brought it to my next therapy session. My therapist read it slowly. She put it down and said, "This is a demand disguised as a feeling." I almost laughed. I said, "Every sentence my mother has ever spoken to me has been a demand disguised as something else." Letter 3 came in month 3. I opened it standing in the kitchen and I read it and I had to sit down. Vivian wrote about attending my school plays. She wrote about helping me with homework. She wrote about throwing me birthday parties with cake and streamers and friends from school. None of these things happened. Not one. I read the letter out loud to Caleb that night. When I finished, he said, "Is she lying on purpose or does she actually believe this?" I folded the letter back up and then I said, "I used to think she was lying. Now I think she rewrote the story so many times in her head that it became real to her." I went to my desk and pulled out a manila folder. I put the letter inside. I wrote one word on the tab, evidence. Letter 4 came in month 4 and it was the worst one yet. It said, "Sammy told me you refused to even consider helping. You were always the cold one. I do not know where I went wrong with you." My hands shook when I read it. I was so angry I could feel it in my teeth. I sat down at the kitchen table and I pulled out a notebook and I started writing. I wrote 4 pages. I wrote about the calculus test and the trash bags on the lawn. I wrote about being told at 6 that I was a mistake. I wrote about being told at 12 that I would never be loved because of the shape of my nose. When Caleb came downstairs, I was still writing. He sat next to me and waited until I put the pen down. Then I picked up the pages and I read them to him, all of them, out loud. When I finished, I looked at the pages in my hands. Then I tore them up. I tore them into small pieces and I pushed the pieces into a pile in the middle of the table. I said, "She does not get my anger. My anger is mine, not Vim." Later that same month, we were all sitting at the dinner table. Lena was talking about a project at school. And then Lena stopped and looked at me and said, "Mom, do you have a mom?" The table went quiet. I looked at Caleb. He gave me a small nod. I said, "I do. Her name is Vivian. She was not a good mother to me, and I have not talked to her in a very long time." Lena said, "Is she the one who sent the letters?" I said, "Yes." Lena said, "Are you going to write back?" I said, "I do not know yet." And then Wei, my 10-year-old, who I thought was not even paying attention, looked up and said, "You do not have to if she was mean to you." I looked at my son. I looked at this 10-year-old kid who had just said the simplest, most most true thing anyone could say. My 10-year-old understood something my mother never learned in 74 years. Sammy called again later in month 4. His voice was different this time. He sounded tired. He said, "She calls me every day. She cries on the phone. She says I am the only one who loves her." I said, "And what do you do?" Sammy said, "I tell her I love her, and then I hang up, and I feel like I am going to throw up." I said, "That is what it felt like to be me for 16 years. There was a long silence. Then Sammy said, "I am starting to understand that." I said, "Sammy, you were her favorite. She built you to need her approval so you would never leave. And now that she needs you, you do not know how to show up because she never taught you how." There was another silence. Then Sammy said, "That is the worst thing anyone has ever said to me." I said, "It is also true." I brought the conversation with Sammy to my next therapy session. My therapist said, "You are naming the system. Vivian did not just hurt you individually. She built a family structure where one child received love and one child received blame. Both roles are cages." I said, "Sammy is still in his cage." My therapist said, "Sammy is starting to see the bars. That is his journey. Your journey is making sure you do not build the same cage for Lena and Wei." I felt that in my chest. I said, "That is the thing I am most afraid of." My therapist looked at me and said, "The fact that you are afraid of it means you are already doing it differently." The 5th letter arrived in month 5. This envelope was thicker than the others. At lunch, I closed my office door. I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages. The letter began, "I am writing this because Sebastian told me that apologies that do not name the specific harm are not apologies. They are requests for forgiveness dressed up as accountability." I stopped reading. I had never heard my mother use the word accountability. Vivian wrote about telling me at 6 that I was a mistake, but this time she did not just name it. She wrote, "I said that because I was angry at your father for leaving, and I put that anger on you because you looked like him." I sat with that for a second. I had been punished for having my father's face. I was 6 years old. Then Vivian wrote about the college acceptance letter. She wrote, "I threw it away. I told you the school never responded. I did this because I did not want you to leave. Not because I loved you, but because I needed someone to blame, and if you left, I would have no one." I put the letter down on my desk. I had applied to that school when I was 17. It was the school I wanted. I had waited for months for a response, and when nothing came, I had assumed I did not get in. I went to the cheaper school closer to home. I built a good life. I moved on. But I had never known. For 26 years, I had believed that school rejected me. I believed I was not good enough. And the whole time, the letter had been in my mailbox, and my mother had taken it and thrown it away. I sat at my desk for 20 minutes without moving. It was the feeling of finding out that a wall you walked into every day for 26 years was not a wall at all. It was a door that someone locked from the other side while you stood there thinking the problem was you. I picked up my phone and I called Caleb. I said, "She threw away my acceptance letter." Caleb said, "What acceptance letter?" I told him. There was silence on the line. Then Caleb said, "You got in?" I said, "I got in, and she threw it away and told me I did not get in, and I believed her because I was 17, and she was my mother." Caleb said, "Come home." When I got home, Caleb was already on the couch waiting for me. I sat down next to him with the letter. He took it from me and read it. When he finished, he said, "This is the first real thing she has ever written to you." I said, "I know." I read the letter a second time, then a third. I did not put this letter in the folder. I took it upstairs and I opened my nightstand drawer and I put it inside. The folder was for documentation. The nightstand was for the things I kept close. The 6th letter came in month 6. Vivian wrote about Sebastian and the therapy. She wrote that Sebastian had asked her about Bridget, her mother, my grandmother, the woman I had met maybe 5 times in my life. Vivian wrote, "My mother did to me what I did to you. I am not saying this as an excuse. Sebastian says understanding the pattern is not the same as forgiving the pattern. I did not invent this cruelty. I inherited it, and I passed it on because I did not know I was carrying it." I read this letter to my therapist at my next session. My therapist said, "How does it feel to hear her name the cycle?" I thought about it. Then I said, "It feels like she is finally speaking a language I can understand. And I hate that it took her 74 years, and cancer, and a nursing facility, and a therapist named Sebastian to learn it." The 7th letter came in month 7. Vivian wrote about Zephaniah, her father. She wrote about how Zephaniah would sit in a room and not see her. She wrote about how Bridget punished her for existing the same way Vivian had punished me for existing. I read this letter, and for the first time I felt something I did not expect. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition. I could see her. A little girl in a house with a mother who never let her pick her own shoes, who told her she was wrong about her own life, who made her small every single day. I brought this letter to therapy. I said, "I can see the blueprint now. Bridget built Vivian and Vivian built me. The only difference is I noticed what I was carrying before I put it on my kids." My therapist looked at me and said, "That is not a small difference. That is the whole difference." Month 8. The kids were in bed. The house was quiet. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a blank piece of paper and I wrote a letter by hand. I wrote, "Vivian, I have received your letters. I have read every one of them. I am not ready to be in regular contact with you. I may visit you once. If I visit, the visit will not be the beginning of a relationship. It will be the end of a phase of my own healing. I need you to understand that. Do not expect more." I read the letter to Caleb. When I finished, he looked at me and said, "Is that what you want to send?" I said, "It is what is true." He said, "Then send it." I mailed it the next morning. 3 weeks later, I got in my car and I drove 3 hours to the facility. I did not bring Lena. I did not bring Wei. I did not bring Caleb. I went alone. I signed in at the front desk and the woman behind the counter looked at me and said, "She has been talking about you all week." I said nothing. Vivian was sitting in a chair by the window. She looked smaller than she had looked on my porch 8 months ago. She looked up when I walked in. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Vivian said, "You came." I said I might. I decided to. Vivian said, "Thank you." I sat in the chair across from her. I did not move it closer. We talked about the weather for a few minutes. We talked about Sebastian and the therapy. Then I said, "I want to ask you about something you did not put in the letters." Vivian's face changed. She said, "Okay." I said, "When I was 8, you took me to buy shoes for the school year. I picked out a pair of red sneakers. You told me they were ugly and that I had no taste. You made me put them back and you bought me the brown ones you wanted. When we got home, I wore the brown shoes and you said, 'See, those are better. You never know what is good for you.'" Vivian stared at me. She said, "I do not remember that." I said, "I know you do not. That is the point." The letters named the big things. The big things were not what broke me. The small things things broke me. The daily, ordinary way you told me I was wrong about my own life. Vivian was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I did that every day, did I not? I said, yes. Vivian said, Sebastian told me I would hear things I do not remember doing. He said the things I do not remember are the ones that mattered most. I said, Sebastian is right. There was a silence that lasted maybe 30 seconds. I looked at Vivian. I saw a 74-year-old woman in a facility chair who was once a girl with a mother named Bridget, who never let her pick her own shoes either. I saw the whole line of women who passed the cruelty down. I saw myself at the end of the line. I saw Lena after me, and I thought, the line stops with me. It already stopped. I stopped it the day I closed the door. I stood up. Vivian looked up at me and said, will you come back? I said, I do not know. I am not going to promise you something I cannot keep. You taught me what broken promises feel like. I will not repeat that. Vivian nodded. Her eyes were wet. I walked to the door. I stopped. I turned around. I said, the red sneakers. They were not ugly. Then I left. I drove home. I turned on the radio and listened to a station I like. When I pulled into the driveway, Caleb was standing on the porch. He did not ask how it went. He just opened his arms. I walked into them. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table. I took out the folder labeled evidence. I took out every letter. I put them in a box. I put the box on the top shelf of the closet. I did not throw them away. I did not keep them on my desk. Lena came downstairs for water. She said, Mom, did you go see her today? I said, I did. Lena said, are you okay? I pulled my daughter close and said, I am building something better for you, and it is going to look nothing like what I came from. Lena does not fully understand what that means yet, but one day she will. And when she does, she will know that the line ended with her mother, and that ending it was the bravest thing her mother ever did.